Welcome to Medical Geography and our first lecture. By providing these definitions ahead of time, I think you'll be prepared to go over any lingering questions during class, and we'll also have more time during our actual class period to talk about fun things like cholera and Ebola. So the beauty of this format is that you can pause and continue this presentation at any point, and you can also go back and review this lecture before the exam. While you're listening, I suggest you have a notebook or a tablet available to jot down any questions you might have so I can address them during class. So in this presentation, we'll go over different definitions that are common in medical geography and definitions that we'll use throughout the remainder of the course. So this is actually a pretty important lecture because we'll be returning to the terms that you'll learn here. To start with, we'll think about the definition of medical geography. On the first day of class, I defined geography as the study of why things are where they are, and the study of medical geography as the study of why diseases or health patterns are where they are. So another way of thinking about it is the study of spatial patterns of health and disease. Where are health concerns a problem? Where are they less of a problem? Why do those differences occur from place to place? And where are different diseases and why are they there? Some of the topics that we'll cover are disease diffusion, which refers to how diseases move from one place to another, access to healthcare, who has access, who doesn't, the effect of physical and social environments on health. So how do climate conditions or certain vegetation types affect the occurrence of health or disease, and how do the social conditions or the political conditions in a place affect health? So now we'll jump into those important terms that we'll be returning to throughout the rest of the course. The first term is a congenital disease. When you think of the term congenital, what pops into your head? Well, one that we commonly hear about is a congenital heart condition. And that refers to a heart condition that's present at birth. So a congenital disease or a congenital illness is present at birth. So a person is born with this particular condition or illness. The next term is degenerative disease. And this term refers to something that's characterized by the deterioration of organs or tissues. So if you think about someone who dies of old age, no one dies of old age actually, but what they die of is when their organs just begin to break down and they're no longer functioning correctly. So a degenerative disease is one that's characterized by organs and tissues just deteriorating over time. Then the third term on this slide can contrast a little bit with degenerative disease, which is just the body breaking down or deteriorating within. An infectious disease is one that's caused by a microorganism entering the body. So examples of an infectious disease, we have Ebola, a cold, the flu, cholera, Lyme disease, West Nile, and so on. So anytime a bacterium, a virus, a protozoan, a worm even in some cases, enters the body, we can potentially become sick. And in that case, it would be an infectious disease. Now, it's important to note that infectious diseases are not always contagious. So the flu or the common cold, they're both contagious. If someone coughs on you, you could potentially get that virus into your body and become sick with the flu or the cold yourself. But something like Lyme disease is not contagious. So it's still caused by a microorganism. In this case, a bacterium enters the body and causes Lyme disease. But Lyme disease does not spread person to person, so it's not contagious. So it's an important distinction to make. Infectious diseases are characterized by a microorganism entering our body and making us sick. We may or may not be able to infect another person. It just depends on the specific disease. So we'll be spending a good bit of time talking about infectious diseases in the coming weeks. The next two terms kind of contrast with one another as well. A chronic condition is a disease that's present or recurrent over a long period of time. So the fact that it's a long period of time is what makes it distinct from an acute condition. So diabetes would be an example of a chronic condition. It's something that a person could be dealing with over a long period of time or their entire life, depending on how it's managed. So it's considered to be a chronic condition. Heart disease is another example of a chronic condition. In contrast, an acute condition is a disease that often has a short duration. So it occurs over a short period of time. A cold is an example of an acute condition, or the flu is an acute condition. Oftentimes, the symptoms can be more severe than a chronic condition, but they last for a short period of time. The next term is a subclinical condition. This term refers to an illness that's undetected. It kind of flies below the radar for a healthcare professional. It's subclinical. It's very difficult to detect. So, for example, if someone is infected with HIV, it's subclinical for quite a long time period. It's undetectable unless someone has a specific type of blood test that's able to check for the presence of the virus. So it's subclinical and difficult to detect. And that's related to the next term, which is latency period or incubation period. And this term refers to the time between when the infection actually occurs and the appearance of clinical symptoms. So HIV presents another good example here. When someone is first infected with HIV, it could be months or potentially years before symptoms, clinical symptoms that can be recognized, actually appear. So an HIV infection is subclinical for a long time period. It has a long latency period or a long incubation period. So again, latency or incubation period is the time between when the infection occurs with the microorganism and the appearance of clinical symptoms. The next two terms are related as well. We have endemic disease and epidemic disease. An endemic disease is one that's constantly present in an area, perhaps at low levels, and then at times it surges and we see an increase in cases. One example for that would be in the northeastern U.S., in Connecticut, for example, with Lyme disease. Lyme disease is just endemic there. It's just present. It's not a surprise when someone comes down with Lyme disease because it's just present in that area. In some parts of the world, malaria is endemic. It's just a disease that's a part of life. New cases pop up and it's not a surprise because the disease is endemic. It's present in that area. Epidemic disease, though, is when a disease occurs at a level beyond normal expectations. About 10 years ago, Lyme disease first arrived in the New River Valley around Blacksburg. It was considered epidemic at that time. Lyme disease was not endemic in this part of Virginia about 10 years ago. So that was considered to be epidemic because the disease was new. It occurred at a level beyond what we normally expected. If we suddenly had malaria circulating among our mosquitoes in this part of the world, it would be considered to be epidemic. Malaria is not endemic in the United States. So in that case, it would be considered to be epidemic. Morbidity and mortality are related terms. Morbidity refers to how often a disease occurs in an area. For example, we can think about the number of people who have a certain type of cancer. That would be morbidity. How many people are living with a certain cancer? How many people are living with Lyme disease? Mortality then refers to the number of deaths from a particular illness. How many people have died from the flu this year? That's an important statistic we would want to keep track of. So morbidity is how many people are living with an illness or health condition. Mortality is how many people have died from that condition. Our last terms here are incidence and prevalence, and these are two terms that we'll spend a little bit more time going over in class with an example. I'll have a small exercise for you to do. Incidence is the number of new cases that are diagnosed during a time period. Someone may want to know, last month, how many new cases of Lyme disease were diagnosed in Blacksburg? How many new cases are we talking about? Prevalence refers to the number of people that are sick with a disease at a particular time, regardless of when the disease began. So how many people have the symptoms of Lyme disease right now? Regardless of when they were diagnosed, how many people are currently dealing with Lyme disease? Incidence is the number of new cases of Lyme disease. We can think about incidence and prevalence with different diseases. So we'll spend more time talking about AIDS in the future, but just to compare these terms, I'll use AIDS and the flu as an example. So in the United States, we have a lot of people living with being HIV positive or with AIDS. We have treatments that can help people. So our prevalence of AIDS or HIV positive is actually somewhat high. Fortunately, our incidence is relatively low. We don't have a lot of new cases in the United States because we have a decent understanding of how to prevent it, and we also have the resources to do so. So incidence of AIDS is relatively low because we don't have a lot of new cases. But prevalence of AIDS is fairly high because when someone does become HIV positive, our healthcare system is able to keep them alive for a longer period of time. So prevalence is relatively high. And again, prevalence is the number of people that are sick with a disease or a health condition, regardless of when the disease began. The flu would be another example. In the middle of flu season, now flu is an example of an acute condition. So the symptoms don't last very long, but they're somewhat severe. So in the middle of flu season, the prevalence of flu may not be all that high because someone gets sick with the flu and then they recover fairly quickly. But incidence could be pretty high because we could have a high number of new cases in any given time period. Also with the Ebola outbreak, Ebola is another acute condition. You get sick and you either recover from Ebola fairly quickly within a week or two, or a person might pass away from it. So incidence of Ebola in the middle of an outbreak could be relatively high, but prevalence is not very high because people either recover quickly or they die pretty quickly from it. So again, if you have questions about incidence or prevalence in particular, we'll be spending a little bit more time on those two terms during class just to try to sort out the differences. So hopefully you have a better understanding of these different terms than when the presentation started. And again, if you have any questions, you're welcome to email me or certainly bring it up during class at any point. So that ends this presentation, and I think you'll be better prepared for the next lecture.